Now to President Trump's new strategy for Greenland, threatening some NATO allies with a 10% tariff. This as thousands gathered in Denmark to support the Arctic territory, waving flags and holding up signs reading "Hands off Greenland." And a group of U.S. lawmakers traveling to Denmark showing their support for the American ally. Here's ABC's senior White House correspondent, Selena Wang.
Tonight, President Trump issuing a new threat to our European allies who oppose a U.S. takeover of Greenland. Trump posting on Truth Social that 8 of our NATO allies, including Denmark, France, Germany, and the United Kingdom, will face 10% tariffs starting on February 1st. Adding that those tariffs will jump to 25% in June until a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. For weeks, Trump has been escalating his threats, saying the U.S. will have Greenland one way or another, refusing to rule out the use of military force. In response, those countries have sent small groups of military forces to the island nation, backing our NATO ally Denmark, which has long controlled Greenland.
Greenland's not for sale!
It comes as thousands march through the streets of Copenhagen today in protest, many waving Greenland's flag, holding signs that read "Make America Smart Again" and "Hands Off."
President Trump today threatening a tariff on 8 European countries that oppose the U.S. taking control of Greenland. We see Denmark responding, saying it will not, quote, bow down to bullying tactics by Trump. Are these bullying tactics, and is there a good national security rationale for these actions and for Trump's push for Greenland?
I think just some of the previous comments there, I would probably disagree quite strongly. As a military member myself, as a colonel in the reserves and a prior commander, national security is incredibly important. And when you look at Venezuela, you look at Iran, these are incredibly strategic. Venezuela itself, you could not have China and Iran that close to our southern borders. And when you're looking at Greenland, the national security picture there, we have tried for 150 years to purchase that. I guess most recently, right after World War II with President Truman for about $100 million. Now, I certainly would like to see that with some type of deal and a purchase as well. Nobody wants any military action there, especially with NATO action, with NATO allies. I don't foresee that happening.
Jonathan, we have some new polling data. A Greenland takeover is broadly unpopular with the American public. If Trump continues to focus on this and not our economy, for example, is that a gift to Democrats heading into the midterms?
Right, and that kind of piggybacks on what I was saying earlier, which is, you know, again, healthcare costs skyrocketing, premiums skyrocketing directly because of that so-called big, beautiful bill and Trump getting rid of the Obamacare subsidies. That's what Americans care about.
Today, Greenland becoming a fast-moving issue at the intersection of trade, security, and Arctic geopolitics. President Trump announcing new tariffs targeting several European countries, tying the pressure campaign to renewed U.S. demands around Greenland. The president posting this lengthy message this morning. I'm going to read it. We have subsidized Denmark and all of the countries of the European Union and others for many years by not charging them tariffs or any other forms of remuneration. Now, after centuries, it is time for Denmark to give back. World peace is at stake. China and Russia want Greenland, and there is not a thing that Denmark can do about it. They currently have 2 dog sleds as protection, 1 added recently. Only the United States of America under President Donald J. Trump can play in this game, and very successfully at that. Nobody will touch this sacred piece of land, especially since the national security of the United States and the world at large is at stake. On top of everything else, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland have journeyed to Greenland for purposes unknown. This is a very dangerous situation for the safety, security, and survival of our planet. These countries who are playing this very dangerous game have put a level of risk in play that is not tenable or sustainable. Therefore, it is imperative that in order to protect global peace and security, strong measures be taken so that this potentially perilous situation end quickly and without question. Starting on February 1st, 2026, all of the above mentioned countries, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdoms, the Netherlands, and Finland, will be charged a 10% tariff on any and all goods sent to the United States of America. On June 1st, 2026, the tariff will be increased to 25%. This tariff will be due and payable until such time as a deal is reached for the complete and total purchase of Greenland. The United States has been trying to do this transaction for over 150 years. Many presidents have tried, and for good reason, but Denmark has always refused. Now, because of the Golden Dome and modern-day weapon systems, both offensive and defensive, the need to acquire is especially important. Hundreds of billions of dollars are currently being spent on security programs having to do with the dome, including for the possible protection of Canada. And this very brilliant but highly complex system can only work at its maximum potential and efficiency because of angles, meets, and bounds, if this land is included in it. The United States of America is immediately open to negotiation with Denmark and/or any of these countries that have put so much at risk, despite all that we have done for them, including maximum protection over so many decades. Thank you for your attention to this matter. The president saying that this morning. Trump's post is triggering sharp reactions domestically and across Europe. National security analyst, retired Marine intelligence officer, and host of the Strat podcast, Hal Kempfer, here with me. So, Trump is scheduled to travel on Tuesday, Hal, to the World Economic Forum in Switzerland. He is likely going to be running into the European leaders that he just threatened with tariffs. What are these countries going to need to hash out before the February tariff deadline?
Well, they're going to talk about Greenland. They're going to probably have an intense discussion about why does the U.S. have to acquire Greenland? What does the U.S. want out of that ownership of that territory? I wouldn't be surprised if someone pulls out a map and says, by the way, when you look at a regular map, Greenland looks huge and Africa looks small. That's because it's a big square map. And if you actually break it into it, it's completely different. Greenland's pretty big, don't get me wrong, but it's not as big as the continent of Africa by any means. So a lot of times people look at the map, they get a big idea that the way up north and way down south is a lot bigger. I hate to say it's that simple, but there have been those who've talked about meetings with President Trump where he seems to look at Greenland and he says, wow, that's huge. And it does look bigger than what it is. Now, we have a treaty, a 1951 bilateral treaty with Denmark that allows us to put bases wherever we want, allows us to do military presence. Denmark does have a say in that. So theoretically speaking, Denmark could obstruct our desires to put bases in there. They have not indicated they would ever do so. In fact, they've said quite the opposite. So that's part of it. But we don't own those bases outright. That's a little bit different. And one of the compromises that's been kicked around is to take the British model. For example, if you go to Cyprus and you go to the British airfield in Cyprus, that is actually sovereign British territory. It's kind of a fluky thing in international law, but they actually own that territory. It's like a big embassy. And other places in the world, the U.S. has the same way. If you, for example, go down to the Philippines, you can visit the big veteran cemetery. It's huge in Manila. That is technically U.S. territory. That is actually sovereign U.S. territory. It's part of the embassy. That's one of the ideas that's being kicked out there, is maybe coming back, instead of giving all of Greenland to the U.S. or selling all of Greenland, maybe just wherever the U.S. wants to put bases would become sovereign U.S. territory. But right now, we can pretty much do militarily whatever we want to do in Greenland without any restrictions.
You know, I've been tracking some of the domestic reaction here, Hal. Senator Tom Tillis of North Carolina, he said this response, and by the way, I'll also just mention that there is sort of a name for what you're describing. The further something is away from the equator on a map, it's called the Mercator projection distortion. So anything that's farther, north or farther south on a map, it tends to be projected larger than your eye might think. Tom Tillis, the senator from North Carolina, responding to Trump's tariff threat, saying, "This response to our own allies for sending a small number of troops to Greenland for training is bad for America, it's bad for American businesses, and it's bad for America's allies." Tillis says it's great for Putin, Xi, and other adversaries who want to see NATO divided. Does Tillis have a point?
I think Senator Tillis does have a point, and part of it is because if you look at the reaction, 10%, that's a huge tariff. We're talking before President Trump came into office, we had free trade agreements all around the world. We had virtually no tariffs for many, many years. And now to slap on a 10% tariff on top of the other tariffs we already have with these countries, and then to say we're going to bump that up to 25%, just because I don't know if it's hundreds, but dozens of military members from other NATO countries went to Greenland to do training. An exercise, by the way, which is not a mystery. The U.S. was actually invited to participate in that very same training, and we declined that invitation. That would somehow warrant this huge reaction of using tariffs as a tool. And by the way, when doing something like that, based on how I'm reading the intent of all the European countries and certainly Denmark, they're going to reciprocate. They're not going to sit there idle. And if you want to look at an example of the second, third order effects, you can look at the remarks between Xi and Carney in Canada, where Canada dropped its tariffs against Chinese EVs and other products tremendously, and of course China reciprocated by dropping many of its tariffs against agricultural products coming from Canada, and so opening up that alliance even further, which kind of undermines, even though President Trump kind of tried to put a positive spin on it, does kind of undermine some of the things that we've been trying to do to kind of check Chinese influence.
Some of the reaction abroad to this, including from European leaders, France's Macron reacting with this, saying, France is committed to the sovereignty and independence of nations in Europe and elsewhere. This guides our choices. It underpins our commitment to the United Nations and to its charter. It is on this basis that we support and will continue to support Ukraine, and that we have built a coalition of the willing for a robust and lasting peace to defend these principles and our security. It is also on this basis that we decided to take part in the exercise organized by Denmark and Greenland. We fully assume this decision because security in the Arctic and at the outer edges of our Europe is at stake. No intimidation or threat will influence us, neither in Ukraine nor in Greenland, nor anywhere else in the world when we are confronted with such situations. Tariff threats are unacceptable and have no place in this context. Europeans will respond in a united and coordinated manner should they be confirmed. We will ensure that European sovereignty is upheld. It is in this spirit that I will engage with our European partners, Macron said. Hal, as of today, how would you describe the state of NATO?
Well, the state of NATO is probably the worst it's been in some time. There's just a tremendous tension with the transatlantic alliance. It's interesting. Certainly the Soviet Union and Putin and Russia have always had a long-term goal of somehow breaking apart the transatlantic alliance. That was very apparent in the 2010s and pretty apparent in the 2000s that was the Russian goal and objective, was to put a schism in that alliance. And certainly when President Trump's first term, when he started talking about, do we need to be part of NATO, that caused huge reverberations throughout Europe and elsewhere. It's also caused Europe to do something which President Trump wanted them to do, which was to finally start investing in their own defense, quit leaning on the U.S. to do everything for them. And if you look at the European Union, I think it's about 450 million people. The U.S. is 350 million people. And why does an area comprising of 450 million people need the U.S. with a population of 350 million to protect it against a country with 150 million people, which is Russia? And so there was a argument to be made there that Europe needs to do more for itself. This will definitely force that to happen. Nobody likes to see how the sausage is made, but if the goal was to get Europe to really invest heavily in its own defense and the defense of its territories, this is definitely causing that to happen.
Trump is talking about his Golden Dome concept. He says Greenland is critical to the dome. He says the U.S. is ready to defend not only American territory, but also Canadian territory with the dome. So how the U.S. already operates key Arctic capabilities within existing agreements. Is it clear what specific capability sovereignty would actually add to the equation?
Well, what sovereignty would do with a big physical investment and a large investment of personnel in Greenland. Right now we have a couple of hundred up at the Space Force base at Patuxent, but What you would see is probably a much more robust presence. I don't think it'll get up to the 10,017 bases that we had during the Cold War, but it could be much more. But if we're going to put that investment in, we want to make sure that that investment is sound, that there won't be any interruption in what's going on there. And I think that may be, and I'm trying to read the tea leaves on this. Believe me, everybody's a little confused as to why, but if we own the territory, then whatever's there, no other nation can ever step in for any reason to undermine what we're doing. And there is a little reading of history here. During World War II, Denmark was basically overrun by the Nazis. In fact, it wasn't a very long campaign. They just basically ran right through it and took it over, which for a period left a kind of a strange thing where Greenland was technically under Denmark, which was ruled by the Nazis. So was Greenland part of Nazi Germany? And there was a quick agreement that was written between the U.S. ambassador, between the U.S. and the ambassador to the U.S. for Denmark, which allowed the U.S. to go in there. And actually, the first combat action against the Nazis was before Pearl Harbor, before we were actually in World War II, and it was in Greenland, and we basically controlled Greenland throughout all of World War II. So there is that little bit of history there to say that militarily speaking, it's always been the U.S. that is backstops what's in Greenland. And the idea is that we definitely want to be able to control what's there, and we don't want it in any way subject to the whims or the desires or political necessity of another nation, that nation in this case being Denmark. And that may be part of the thinking behind why we find ownership.